Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I can see that the numbers are still going up a little bit, so we will start in just a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm and summery welcome to you all to this, the last of our online third Thursday events for the current season. We will be taking a break in August, along with many other people, I think, and we'll be back in September. We're very much hoping that with the lifting of the pandemic restrictions, we will be able to return to our normal venue in the Cathedral Hostelry, just behind me. So we'll actually be indoors rather than outdoors. But we'll see how that goes and we'll keep you posted. We will have a special e-bulletin for you in August. So please keep a close eye on that. And we'll have news of our new season starting in September. It's been a busy time for us here at the Sainsbury Institute before we move into our summer quiet period. This week we started our second online summer program in Japanese cultural studies, replacing our usual in-person summer programs here in Norwich. I'm delighted to say we've got about 350 registrants from 52 different countries joining us for a very varied program this year. And we're delighted with that. And I know that some of those participants are joining us this afternoon. So thank you very much indeed to you, because I know you've had a busy day in front of the computer screens already. What else did I want to just touch on before we begin? Yes, we have a couple of other summer events for you, which I wanted to just bring to your attention. If you're in or around Norwich, or you're going to be visiting over the summer, please do drop by the Sainsbury Centre on campus at the University of East Anglia, where we've got two Japan-themed displays. One is a smaller display called Faces of Faith, where we are examining a statue which is a possible relation of a very important person in the history of Japanese Buddhism, Shotoku Taishi, whose 1400th anniversary of his death is being marked this year. And we've got some nice digital work accompanying that. And particularly excitingly, from this weekend, we have a major new exhibition by the Swiss-Japanese artist Leiko Ikimura called Usagi in Wonderland. I hope that you'll all get to the chance to see this exhibition while it's on. It'll be on at least until the end of the year. As I say, starting tomorrow, and this will be Leiko Ikimura's first UK show. So we're very excited to be hosting that at the Sainsbury Centre, and we'll be talking more about that in due course. So this afternoon, we're going to go back in time a little bit for you. I'm going to share my screen now. And oh dear, we're on the wrong, so I'm going to end that just a second. We're on the wrong slide, doesn't do, so let's get it to the beginning. There we are, that's more like it. That's where we want to start. As I said in this month's e-bulletin, we're celebrating Jōmon July, and we're heading back to Japanese prehistory. The reason for this is that as of tomorrow, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee will be meeting, And as part of its business between now and the end of July, they will hopefully be approving the inscription of 17 Jōmon sites from northern Japan, from northern Tohoku and southern Hokkaido, as UNESCO World Heritage. It's very exciting. The Sainsbury Institute have been involved in this initiative for over 10 years now, and I thought we couldn't let this opportunity pass without indulging a little bit in my own passion, which, as many of you already know, is Jōmon archaeology. And this afternoon, I'm going to speak about some research that we're doing on Jōmon stone circles and how that relates to World Heritage, and give you an insight into some of the initiatives which we're going to be presenting in the future and which are available to you this month as well. I'm going to be joined a little bit later on by Heather Sabir. Heather is the Senior Property Curator at Stonehenge for English Heritage, and also by David Dawson, who is the Director of the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes, both of whom we couldn't have better people to tell us about stone circles, really. And I'm delighted that they're with us this afternoon, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion at the end of my talk. Now, some people tell me that they ask why I study this very long period of Japanese prehistory. The Jōmon period began some 16,000 years ago and continued until just over 2,000 years ago. Why I study such a period where, over very long periods of time, it seems that nothing very much happened. Well, all sorts of things did happen. And on the slide now, you can see an advert. There was some blatant promotion of other things that we're doing for our most recent podcast with Dr. J. Alyssa White from the University of Oxford, who has been studying this amazing skeleton. About 3,000 years ago, this chap went swimming, maybe not intentionally, but certainly ended up in the sea, the inland sea, just off Okayama Prefecture, and was attacked by a shark. He died tragically in that attack, but his body was recovered, brought back, and buried at the Tsukumo Shell Midden in Okayama. And some amazing research has been done just recently, just published over the last month or so, about the analysis of the skeleton, telling us exactly what happened. So for this person, something certainly did happen in the Jōmon period, and we know there are many, many such events and other things, and the archaeologist's job is to try and piece together the fragments that we have from that long period to tell some compelling narratives about it. I would direct you to that wonderful podcast, and in fact, we've got 3 Jōmon-themed podcasts on our Japan in Norwich website, and if you find what I'm talking about this evening of interest, do go and listen to those. Now, of course, I'm speaking to you from the Cathedral Close in Norwich, our wonderful historic city, and I'm going to go right back to the very beginnings of awareness of Japanese archaeology in the UK, and that was a conference, the International Congress of Prehistoric Archaeology, held in 1868. This gentleman, Augustus Wollaston Franks, gave a presentation, which we think is probably the first ever presentation in a Western language about the possibility of a Stone Age in Japan. And he illustrated it with these stone tools. What I found particularly interesting about this is, as you'll see in the middle of the screen, this conference took place in Norwich. And I rather like to think that Augustus Wollaston Franks was speaking not perhaps too far away from where I am now, on the 20th or sometime in the week of the 20th of August, 1868, introducing Japanese archaeology to people here. Now, at the same time that Franks was speaking in Norwich, or maybe in London, not quite sure which, this gentleman, Minamushi Sanjin, was traveling all around northern Japan, in particular the areas of modern-day Akita Prefecture and Aomori Prefecture, undertaking his own antiquarian or archaeological investigations. He was digging at sites which were well known to produce objects from antiquity, and he wasn't only digging them up to take them home, but he was also putting them on display. And he left a wonderful illustrated diary, which an amazing free publication called the Jōmon Zine has been serializing recently. And here you can see him with a selection of Jōmon artifacts, including ceramic figurines and pots and other objects, and these temporary traveling displays that he set up close to where he was working. Now, Minamushi Sanjin was one of many native Japanese antiquarians that we know about. And so the normal story that we hear about Japanese archaeology, that it was really started by this man, Edward Sylvester Morse, who was the first professor of anthropology at the University of Tokyo, needs a little bit more embellishing, I feel, and we need to understand what Morse was doing in the context of the extraordinary networks of antiquarians who were very active in Japan, in particular, all through the Edo period, so from the 17th century through to the middle of the 19th century. And Minamushi Sanjin was in that tradition. However, it was really with Morse that what we recognize today as maybe Western scientific style archaeology in Japan arrived. Here he is, and this is an illustration of the very first archaeological excavation that he undertook at the Aomori shell middens, which lie on the railway tracks just between Yokohama, which was the port where he would have landed, and the city of Tokyo. He would have taken a route, his report, he would have taken a route which would have brought him to this station, Shimbashi Station, which was then the terminus of the line in from Yokohama. Now that line was built in the 1870s, opened in 1872, and it was British engineers were responsible for its construction. And the hot news from Tokyo archaeology is that in an area around Shinagawa, the modern Shinagawa station, a short distance to the west of Shimbashi Station, a 1.6 kilometer section of the original railway embankment has been discovered. And there is a huge movement afoot to try and preserve as much as possible of this railway embankment because it is seen as testimony to the industrial revolution that was sweeping Japan in the Meiji period. And that discussion has reached the Prime Minister's office, and I know that some of that embankment is going to be preserved, although probably not as much as our Japanese archaeological colleagues would have wished. I seem to have lost the functionality here. Okay. Now, somebody who may well have ridden that line is this gentleman, Tsuboi Shogoro. And it's quite possible that he took the train from Tokyo. Tsuboi was the first Japanese professor of anthropology at the University of Tokyo. And in the late 1880s, he came and spent 2 years studying in London with Edward Burnett Tyler. Now, Tyler is in many ways the founding figure of British social anthropology. While Tsuboi was in London, he came up with some really amazing insights, one of which was to identify this object, which we displayed at the British Museum in our Dogu exhibition more than 10 years ago now. Tsuboi was wandering the ethnography galleries of the British Museum, and he spotted these snow goggles as worn by Siberian native peoples, indigenous peoples, and he decided that this figurine, which had been dug up just a few years before he arrived in London, dug up indeed in Aomori, right up in the north of Japan, he decided this figurine was perhaps wearing snow goggles, was a depiction of something wearing snow goggles of this sort. And we know that today, Aomori, northern Japan, the Japan Sea coast in particular, is amongst the snowiest places in the world. So it seemed that seemed like a reasonable hypothesis to put forward. We now know that may not be the case, but it's very interesting that we've got these very early connections between British and Japanese archaeology. Now, while Tsuboi was in London, he traveled around a little bit and he visited Stonehenge, perhaps the most iconic, famous British prehistoric sites that we've got, indeed famous the world over, pre-pandemic, attracting 1.5 million visitors a year these days to their wonderful new visitor centre. And of course, I'd encourage anybody who hasn't already been to go and enjoy this wonderful site of British prehistory. This, I think, is the first mention of Stonehenge in a Japanese archaeological publication, or probably in any publication actually, from the 28th year of the Meiji era, 1895. And I'm very grateful to my long-term research collaborator, Mr. Miyao Toru from the Niigata Prefectural Museum of History, who found this for me and sent it through. And you can see it's images of Stonehenge, along with images of Karnak in northern France, reproduced in the pages of the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Tokyo. So we were very excited to find that awareness of Stonehenge was so early in Japan. Stonehenge today, of course, wonderful, iconic site. It has an amazing sense of timelessness to it. And I think many visitors probably feel it's always looked exactly like that. There's a huge amount of contemporary research happening all around Stonehenge, rewriting the stories. I'm sure that some of you have been following some of these amazing discoveries in the media. What this research is demonstrating is that Stonehenge as a monument has a very complicated and long history, from about 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago, to round about over about a period of about 1,000 years. It underwent a process of transformation from a relatively simple henge monument, just a ditch and a bank and some wooden posts, through to the stone circle monument that we're all familiar with today. What some of you may know, some of you won't possibly know, is that there are early Japanese connections in terms of the research into Stonehenge, largely through this gentleman, William Gowland. Now, Gowland had spent 16 years as a foreign specialist, one of the Oyatoi Gaikokujin, in Japan during the Meiji period, the same period when British engineers were behind the first railways being constructed. Gowland's job was rather different. He was employed by the Osaka Mint. He was a metallurgist, a mining engineer by training, and his job was to make the mint, which had been bought in Hong Kong, brought to Osaka, make that mint produce coinage for the new modern Japanese nation state. While in Japan, Gowland developed a passion for archaeology, and he investigated some 400 of the mounded tombs. He's standing inside one of the chambers of these megalithic mounded tombs from a slightly later period in Japanese archaeology to the one we're considering this afternoon, the Kofun period, dated from the 3rd century AD to the beginning of the 8th century AD. And most of the tombs that Gowland were investigating were dated to the 6th and 7th centuries AD. Now, when he returned to the UK, he got involved in a number of different societies, including the Society of Antiquaries in London, the Royal Anthropological Institute, and he was invited when there was a bit of a disaster at Stonehenge. One of the stones collapsed at the beginning of the 20th century. Gowland was invited to undertake investigations there by the Society of Antiquaries and the landowners. And here he is with his wonderful hat on, and there's Gowland in his later years overseeing the operations at Stonehenge. And while he was there, he took the opportunity to undertake some archaeological investigations. And in fact, it was Gowland who was the first person who came up with a reliable date for Stonehenge, putting it towards the end of the Neolithic and perhaps the beginning of the Bronze Age. But as he said, there was no evidence for the use of metal tools in the construction of this monument, and that's what made him think it was possibly earlier than the metal-using ages. In his report, he used Japanese illustrations to show how people could transport the huge stones at Stonehenge without modern technology, without cranes, without machinery. And here he is, and it also showed how Japanese people would have pounded stone, again, with very different technology to what is available to us today. He also flagged up the fact that he thought that Stonehenge was connected to sun worship. And of course, many of us are aware of all the wonderful work that's done in archaeoastronomy these days, which have confirmed that there are connections, the calendrical connections at Stonehenge, which of course makes Stonehenge such a draw for all sorts of people at the summer solstice, as we saw just a month or so ago. And he illustrated his report with this picture of sun worship in Japan, because he recognized, of course, in Japan as well, there was a lot of interest in the sun goddess, of course. Amaterasu, the time that Gowland was there, was regarded as the ancestral figure of the Japanese imperial family. So what about stone circles? It wasn't until a few years later, after Gowland had left, long after Gowland had left Japan, that Neil Gordon Monroe arrived in the early 20th century. He arrived, he was a medical doctor. He worked in the hospital in Yokohama. And he was responsible for undertaking the first large-scale excavation in Japan. He bought his own archaeological site. I don't know if I'm jealous of that or not. It's something we wouldn't dream about doing today, but for the princely sum of £20, Monroe bought the Mitsuzawa shell midden close to where he lived, and then, bless him, he got his wife to excavate it for him. So the first woman archaeologist that we know about in Japan. Monroe wrote the first synthesis of Japanese archaeology, Prehistoric Japan, a wonderful book, 1908, first published. If you ever get the chance, I would suggest you have a look through it. In that book, he published on this site, the Oshoro stone circle in Hokkaido. I think this is this is possibly the first reference to Japanese stone circles that we have in Western languages, and accompanied by these wonderful photographs. We know that the stones at Oshoro, the site itself probably dates to the later Jōmon period, but the stones were moved around, were still used in ritual activities by the indigenous Ainu peoples of the island in much later periods. So we don't quite know what the original arrangement of the stones was like. A similar problem perhaps to what we had at Stonehenge before the investigations there. Interestingly, Monroe also decided that there was a set orientation to the Oshoro stone circles, suggesting that perhaps there was some kind of calendrical significance to the site that he had found there as well. So who were the people who built these stone circles? They are rather remarkable anywhere in the world, to tell the truth. And for my money, they definitely deserve the recognition of the outstanding universal value that the Jōmon cultures have. They created the world's first pottery, some of the world's oldest villages. They had very interesting relationships with plants. They made some of the oldest lacquer that we know about in the world. They weren't farmers, but they perhaps knew about farming, but they chose not to take it up. They seem to have had a very complex worldview for hunter-gatherers. And they had very enhanced social networks linking otherwise independent communities. And I like to think that they had very effective mechanisms for avoiding inherited social hierarchies. So an amazing culture altogether. Here's the very early pottery. This is from Oda Yamamoto, which itself is one of the sites which is included in the World Heritage nomination. We know we have sites of similar dates now from the Russian Far East and also potentially from China, but the best well-dated continuous pottery making sequence that we have is still from Japan. These very early fragments gave rise to what we call the Jōmon period. Jōmon means cord marked pottery, and as I say, dates to around about 16,000 years ago to about 300 BC, divided into different subdivisions. Many different regional pottery styles have been identified. And I'm just showing you a couple of examples of what these, to give you a sense of the complexity of design of some of these Jōmon vessels. And indeed, you can go and see one or two examples in the Sainsbury Centre itself, and also we have some nice examples in the British Museum today. As the period wore on, these ceramics become even more sophisticated, and there's a real focus on eating, consumption, and cooking. It wasn't only pottery vessels that they made, they also make this range of objects which are sometimes described as secondary objects that seem to have a very significant ritual or ritualistic significance to them, especially the ceramic figurines and these polished stone bars. Jōmon people lived very often in relatively settled villages. Here is the excavation of one. As you can see, there's not a lot to see above the ground. And three of the sites in the World Heritage nomination at Sannai, Maryama, Goshono, and Kakinoshima are very significant. In fact, there are more very significant settlements of the Jōmon, but no features surviving above ground. And so that is always a challenge for many people involved in the designation of these sites, because if there's nothing to see above ground, then what is it we're trying to preserve for the future? And that means that archaeologists very often have to reconstruct these sites to allow people today to really understand what was going on. And we can see these people were living in circular shaped villages like this, which suggests that they were a very effective way of maintaining, it's one of the mechanisms they used for maintaining this relatively egalitarian lifestyle that they enjoyed. There's a range of different architectural styles, including some very large buildings, some very deep buildings with sunken floors, buildings with stone floors and elaborate entranceways as well. This is the site of Sandai Maryama, which in many ways is the center of the World Heritage Bid. It's the largest known Jōmon settlement anywhere in Japan, occupied for at least 1,000, possibly up to 2,000 years, from about 4,500 BC, about 6,500 years ago. Over 1,000, the remains of over 1,000 buildings have been recovered, all built out of wood, so of course they don't actually survive, although in some cases we do find the remains of the bases of the posts. For example, in the case of this large wooden tower, which has been reconstructed here. At the Goshono settlement in Iwate Prefecture, many of these houses burnt down in situ. And so we've got the remains of the materials from which the houses were constructed, which allow us to exercise our archaeological imaginations even more, perhaps even more grounded in the actual materials that we used at the time. It's often said that hunter-gatherers don't have much of a sense of their own history, that they live in a cyclical kind of time frame, if you like, every year being much the same as the last. My sense is that actually Jōmon people did have a sense of their own history, and that is represented in the archaeological record through features such as this, where buildings seem to be relatively deliberately rebuilt one on top of each other, or creating these chains of occupation through time. There would have been an awareness that these places had been occupied beforehand. These kind of ideas have allowed my long-term mentor in Jōmon archaeology, Professor Kobayashi Tatsuo of Kokugakuin University in Tokyo, to suggest what the Jōmon universe might have looked like. And he's been very keen to set these sites in their broader landscape, as this illustration from his Jōmon reflections, which we'll come back to a little bit later on, refers to. So these sites are being valued today. As I say, there's a nomination for a World Heritage inscription pending, which hopefully we'll be going through later this month. In advance of the Olympics, which we know we have the opening ceremony at the end of next week, controversially in many ways, because of course we're in the middle of a pandemic and tragically nobody's going to be able to go and watch all of the competitions taking place in the Olympic stadia. There's been an enormous amount of preparation for a huge cultural Olympiad in conjunction with the sports events themselves. In particular, something organized by the Agency for Cultural Affairs in Japan called Japan Heritage. And I would recommend you to go and look at the Japan Heritage website. There are about 100 regions of Japan which have invested very significant resources in telling their local stories. And the idea was that visitors who had never been to Japan before would go to the Olympics in Tokyo, and then they would take the opportunity to travel around Japan as well. Very sadly, that can't happen. Over the summer into the autumn, we're going to be exploring some of these resources using our online magic. Not quite the same as getting there, but of course, when we can return, it means that we'll all have a much better idea of what we can go and see outside Japan, outside Tokyo and Kyoto. Some of these Japan heritage sites and routes are associated with archaeology. And two of them have specific connections to Jōmon archaeology. Here is one of them, which relates to the flame pots, which we've spoken about on many occasions before, and the snow country culture of the Shinano River Basin. And I would very strongly recommend have a look at that. There's some great stories in there. We, of course, have our own archaeological sites here in the UK, apart from Stonehenge. And over the last few years, we've been working with partners at Grimes Graves here in Norfolk, an amazing Neolithic flint mine complex, and friends in Japan. We've been taking Japanese archaeologists to Grimes Graves. You can actually go into the Neolithic mining shafts themselves. It is an extraordinary experience. And again, I would recommend that very strongly to anybody looking for a trip somewhere interesting over the summer. About 5 years ago, we were lucky enough to be able to introduce or to be able to sign agreements with colleagues in Japan, in a small town in Nagano in central Japan, where they have sites very comparable to Grimes Graves, and we created the the world's first twinned archaeological sites on the basis of the comparison between Grimes graves and the Hoshikuso Obsidian Mines in Japan. Each year in Nagawamachi, the small town where these mines are based, they have a Jōmon festival, an obsidian festival. And here I am, a few years ago, meeting Mayor Hata, who has been long-standing mayor of this municipality, very interested in archaeology, and as you can see, really entering into the spirit of the Jōmon activities that are taking place. They built themselves a new town hall in Nagawamachi just a few years ago, and in the entranceway, they have created this amazing artwork which combines traditional Norfolk flint architectural designs with some of the obsidian from Nagawamachi. And I would, if you ever get the chance to go there, do go have a look at this, and we will be having details of this installation built by David Smith, a wonderful flint mason based in Sussex, and our obsidian friends from Nagawamachi as well. And we've had a whole series of exchanges over the years. Now, on the 20th of July, so next week, a brand new museum will open in Nagawamachi, inspired by the museum at Grimes Graves. Here it is, the on-site Obsidian Museum. This is the outside of it. This is the Obsidian Mines of Hoshikuso. And this is what you can see if you go inside. It's actually the shafts that were dug to extract the obsidian. So directly comparable to what we have at Grimes Graves. And I'm assured by our friends in Nagawamachi, directly inspired by what they saw when they came to Grimes Graves a few years ago. They're very proud of this, and I'm delighted that I was able to speak to Mayor Hata and to the archaeologist who's behind all of this, Otake Sachie-san, last week. And we have a little interview here. It's in Japanese, but there are some subtitles which hopefully will give you a flavor of what that was all about. And I'm hoping this is going to work.
そしてどうですか、今年ですね、オリンピックの年ですから、特別の年と思いますけれども、そのために文化庁ですね、このジャパンヘリテージということを作りました。その縄文時代の遺跡も入ってたと聞きましてですけれども、今ですね、長町の方々のために、縄文ということはどういう意義がありますでしょうか。
そうですね、今お話ございましたように、日本遺産にも認定をこのオリンピックを機会にされたわけですけれども、この縄文時代の遺跡や土器で、特にですね、黒曜石はもう当たり前に身近にあるものでした。私ども言っておりましたんですね。で、畑や田んぼや、あるいは自宅の庭にもですね、発見したこの土器や石器、あるいは黒曜石のかけらをですね、大切にコレクションをした記憶は多くの町民の皆さんが共有をしております。ただ、あまりにも身近にありすぎまして、この黒曜石が重要だという認識がちょっとなかなかないようなケースもありますね。はい。で、黒曜石の体験ミュージアムによるこの長年のですね、地道な周知活動、特に大竹さん頑張って、町民の皆さんに大きく周知をしていただきましたので、そしてまた、セインズベリー研究所をはじめとしたイギリスのさまざまな団体との国際交流の事業の成功ですね。そして日本遺産認定という外からの目によってこの長浜町のですね、宝を再認識したというところでございます。ですからイギリスとの交流事業はさらに推し進めてですね、そしてもっと多くの町民の皆さんに我々の宝は世界に通用するものだということに気づいてもらいたいというふうに思っております。
それは素晴らしいですね。そして今新しい黒曜石の博物館もできまして、そしてどうですかね。多分世界中その黒曜石の博物館が2つ2カ所がある町は長浜町しかないんじゃないですかと思いますけれども、それはなか いことだと思いますから、見に来るとすごく楽しみにします。はい。
私の方からもこの施設の建設、黒曜石星クソ館ですね、こちらの施設の、建設にあたってちょっとメッセージを言わせていただこうかと思いますけれども、はい、そうですね、やっぱり一番大きなこの施設の実現の背景にあったのは2016年、5年前に、この日本の黒曜石鉱山と、イギリスのフリント鉱山のグライムス・グレーブスが世界初の、双子遺跡の協定を結んだことなんですね。このことから私たちはすごく多くのことを学びました。グライムス・グレーブスの、シャフトを、ね、公開する、展示施設がありますけれども、施設というのはまさに現代の我々が祖先と同じ空間を共有できるという非常に刺激的なそういう展示施設だと思うんですね。でこの展示施設から伝わるものというのがたくさんあると思うんですけれども、例えば、その歴史的な空間というのは、考古学者にとっては遺跡で発見される土器やあるいは石器といった遺物、そして住居などの遺構からその歴史を証明するという、そういう手がかりとして研究をしているわけですけれども、グライムス・グレーブスのシャフトは遺跡を残した人がいるんだという、そこに人間がいるんだということを、我々の研究の上で常に意識しなければいけないという基本理念を伝えている、施設だと思うんです。またおそらく歴史的な空間で得られた感動というのは多くの市民にとっては、こういった歴史遺産を未来に継承していくという意義を、考えることのできるそういう経験につながるものではないかなというふうに、感じています。我々の長浜町の星クソ館も30年の研究を経てようやくその展示公開する施設が実現したわけですけれども、今後ですね、この施設をどういうふうに研究あるいは市民の歴史教育に生かしていくべきなのか、そのためには今回のように世界的なその情報をお互いに共有して共にその歴史遺産の活用についての未来を一緒に学んでいければというふうに思っております。そういう意味で最後になりますけれども、こういった世界的な情報を共有できる場を作ってくださった、セインズベリー日本芸術研究所、そしてサイモン・ケーナ先生、そして、多くの関係者の皆様に改めて心から、御礼を申し上げたいと思います。そしてぜひ健康でお過ごしいただきまして、お互いが、笑顔で再会できる日を祈っておりますので、本当にありがとうございました。
そしてどうですか
So thank you very much to Mayor Hata and Otake-san. And many congratulations on the opening of that wonderful museum. I can't wait to get to go and see it myself. Now, as I said, the Jōmon World Heritage nomination hopefully will go forward in July 2021. This is a photo of the delegation that we took to the UNESCO headquarters in Paris back in 2010, when we organized one of the earliest conferences on this whole matter. On the right, on the left, you can see a map of the sites which are involved, 17 sites altogether, including 4 sets of stone circles. And it's those sites that I want to turn to in just a second. And this is all forms part of a collaborative research project, which we're undertaking with colleagues at English Heritage. I'm very grateful to all of them, and some of them who were able to come out to Japan with us in 2019. And we'll be having an exhibition at Stonehenge at the World Heritage Site Visitor Centre in autumn 2022. Sorry, I haven't updated that. It was going to be this year, in fact, it was going to be last year, but thanks to the pandemic, it's 2 years delayed. So autumn 2022 through to autumn 2023. Huge amount of publications on stone circles, monuments and landscapes in Japan. Here's just a few of them that I've been reading through over the last little while. And here's a map showing the number of sites which are considered to be stone circles or very close relations of those stone circles in Japan. So quite large numbers, as you can see. I'm going to focus in on perhaps the most famous one, which is the Oyu stone circles in Akita Prefecture in northern Japan, famous for producing this rather wonderful little figurine, which we'll be featuring hopefully in the exhibition next year with possible numerical notation on it. Just to remind us of the chronology that we've got, I'm very grateful to my colleague, Dr. Uchiyama Junzo, who is our former Handa Jōmon Archaeology Fellow, for putting these particular set of slides together for me. You can see the Oyu here is about 4,200 to about 3,700 years ago, roughly comparable to the age of Stonehenge. Just a little bit of information about where these sites are. Above the Oyu River, right in the middle part of Akita Prefecture here, equidistant from the Pacific and Japan Sea coasts. Two stone circles, in fact, the Manza and Nonakado stone circles, and here they are from above. These are reconstructed buildings around the outside, because of course, most of the architecture here is wood. Discovered in the 1930s, excavated in the 1940s, indeed, very early, and again, from 1984 to 2008, an extensive period of field research, resulting in the construction of this rather wonderful new museum on the site in 2002. This is what you see today. Very different to Stonehenge. The stones are much, much smaller. And in many ways, although the word stone circle gets turned into Japanese as stone sakaru in katakana, they're really circular arrangements of settings of stones. So I think that would, but it's a bit of a mouthful. So stone circles works, and everybody in Japan knows what we're talking about, with arrangements of these buildings, these pillared buildings around the outside, which may have been where the deceased were perhaps put on display before being interred in the grave pits underneath many of these stone arrangements. At the center of both stone circles, we have what they call the Sundial Stones, these arrangements here. And some of you will have seen the 3D digital reconstruction that we have on our website, put together by Steve Colmer and another colleague of mine, Corey Noxon, who visited the sites with us back in 2019. Here are the sites, and there are about 90 meters between them. And they're largely aggregations of burials, it seems, but there is also an alignment, as we have at Stonehenge, or the alignment at Stonehenge seems to relate to the midwinter solstice rather than to the midsummer solstice. Here we are. And you can see those two lines that show the summer sunset at summer solstice and the sunrise of the winter solstice. There do seem to be clear alignments there, which I think is of very great interest to those of us with an interest in archaeoastronomy. As at Stonehenge, where a huge amount of research has been done recently looking at Stonehenge in its broader landscape, there's been a lot of investigations of the surrounding area of the Oyu stone circles as well, and that has thrown up a lot of new sites, including more arrangements of stone alignments, more post-hole buildings, and linear alignments of burials, which to me talk about lineages of people being buried there over longer periods of time. And these are some of the plans that just give you an indication of what these things look like. From the burials themselves, the remains are often buried in with pots, as you can see here, and also sometimes with other tools, including hunting tools such as stone arrows, and indeed some lacquered objects have been placed in the burials too. This large number of overlapping buildings, again, says to me that this is a repeated activity that was going on here. We're not sure exactly what was happening, although there are a large number of figurine fragments and other ritual object fragments found amongst these pillared buildings, suggesting that they aren't ordinary domestic features, not ordinary houses, maybe houses for the dead. And there are a number of these small circular alignments have been found in the landscape as well. So a lot of work. This has all just been. These slides come from the summary report. It's a very large series of volumes already, and the interpretation of what these features and the concentrations of these features all means is still very much happening at the moment. We do have assemblages of figurines as well as ceramics. And from those ceramics, it's been possible to get charcoal residues that allow us to start to really get a sense of the historical sequence that radiocarbon dating allows us to understand. So we really start to get an idea of the detail of the sequence here, as we have at Stonehenge. So seeing how the site developed over time, how the landscape develops over time. Five stages of development have been identified, and as at Stonehenge, it's actually not till right at the very end that the stone circles themselves are really developed. Unlike at Stonehenge, where we don't have clay figurines, unfortunately, not yet anyway, we've got about getting on for 200 clay figurine fragments have been discovered from this site, and that's giving us a good insight into the kind of ritual activities that might have taken place there. So that's Stonehenge. That just gives you a flavor. Sorry, that's this Oyu, which gives us just a flavor of the complexity of these monuments. I just want to introduce you to a couple more. This is Isedotai, which has been excavated over the last 20 or so years, discovered in advance of the construction of a new access road to a local airport. And here we've got 4 stone circles, and again, a large number of ceramic figurines. This is what they look like from above, really very large. We've got over 200 figurines from this site, and large numbers of local stones being brought together and made, and you can see at the bottom here, very careful arrangements of those stones. And again, these post-built buildings around the outside of the stone circles themselves, suggesting some very specific activities were taking place there. And these just show some of the plans of the post holes, which are indicative of the presence of these buildings. It's always fun to visit there because you never know if you're going to encounter bears, and everybody is issued with bells to wander around the site with, to make sure they don't frighten the bears off. Well, that's the theory anyway. Here is a selection of the figurines from Isedotai, and in fact the triangular one in the middle may be familiar to some of you who saw the Dogu exhibition that we did back in 2009. Komakino is one of the largest of the stone circles. It's in Aomori. It's number 8 on this plan. Oyu is number 15. Oyu is number 14. So in the mountains, and number 13 is Isedotai. But as you can see again, we've got this double ring of stones with a large stone arrangement in the center. Nearly over 30,000 kilograms of stones altogether, about 3,000 stones being brought together. Very major investments of labor and construction, and built over a considerable amount of time. Different types of stones and different arrangements of stones, as you can see in these charts. Again, just giving some idea of the complexity of the construction processes that went into these stone circles. One of the earlier sites to be discovered was Omori Katsuyama, and this is Mount Iwaki, a wonderful big old extinct volcano in this region in Aomori Prefecture. Here is the stone circle at Omori Katsuyama, and excavated early on, as I said, in the 1950s, 1960s. This one is associated with some large houses, and it seems that maybe this was first a settlement, and only after the settlement was abandoned was it turned into a stone circle, taking on that monumental significance. And these were some of the features that were found. This is the large, up in the top corner here is where this large pit house was found, and there were other settlement features found in the vicinity as well. One of the sites, as I said, there are many stone circles in this part of Japan. One of the ones that didn't make it to the list on the World Heritage nomination is here at Washinoki in Hokkaido, the northernmost island. And here we can see again, there's a local volcano. Here is the stone circle. This site was discovered again in the course of road construction. What they decided to do here, though, rather than diverting the road, was to pop the road in a tunnel underneath the stone circle. Now, we know that that can be contentious with what's happening here in the UK, but I feel they did a really good job, and the site has been preserved in its entirety here, as you can see, on top of the tunnel that was dug underneath the site. Here are just some of the shots of the site being excavated to give you a flavour of what it looked like, and there's again this double circle of stones in the central part of the stone circle, and again associated with a number of residential features. These are pit houses, and some rather wonderful pottery from Washinoki, including these squid-shaped figurines. And indeed, this part of Japan is famous for its squid. If you go there today, you're more than likely to be served squid in one of the local restaurants. There's a huge amount of research going on stone circles in Japan, and as part of our collaborative research project with English Heritage and our colleagues in Japan, we're going to be gathering up all of this information and publishing it in a book in time for the exhibition next year. Discoveries keep being made. In Britain, I don't know when the last time a stone circle was actually discovered. In Japan, it was last year at Nishi Hiranai in Iwate Prefecture. Here it is, one of these stone circles being investigated, discovered last year. There's an exhibition about it this year in the Iwate Prefectural Museum, already happening. You can read much more about these sites in our publications, is one of them. We have things online that tell you about them as well, and we'll be continuing to do that over the course of the coming year. One of the initiatives I'm particularly excited about at the moment is our online Jōmon Matsuri, which we're running with the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre down at the University of Cambridge, and we're going to be on a regular basis putting out your own cutout dogus and Jōmon pots, so to encourage you to sort of really get into some of the detail of the design behind them. And this is all going to be happening, rolling out over the summer. I'm delighted that as of today, Professor Kobayashi's Jōmon Reflections, the only full-color introduction to Jōmon archaeology, is now freely available to download, read and enjoy from Oxbow Books, our publishers. We've just been able to secure that. It's been long out of print, but it still stands, I think, as a very as a standard work, and one of the most important standard works on Jōmon archaeology out there. I'd just like to thank you all for your attention. And these are some of the people that have been helping us over the last few years on this project, and will continue to do so as we develop the exhibition plans. And I just wanted to say that this afternoon, I've got particularly in mind our dear friend Don Henson, who sadly passed away back in April. Don was instrumental in getting us interested in how to work with archaeology as an educational resource, and was very much involved in the work with Nagawa Machi and Grimes Graves. Now, it's my great pleasure to ask Heather Sabir from English Heritage and Stonehenge to switch on her camera, if you're still with us, Heather. I know we have you only for about another 10 minutes or so, but I was just going to invite you really to give us a little bit of a comment from a Stonehenge and English Heritage perspective, and maybe thinking about what, for you, the World Heritage nomination has meant, and how important the international partnerships are for Stonehenge and English Heritage.
Thank you, Simon, for a well talk. And first of all, huge congratulations to colleagues in Japan who were responsible for putting the bid together. I know from other sites that it's a huge amount of work, and to actually get it this far is really fantastic. So very well done. And also the wonderful Obsidian Museum. Lovely to hear from the curator there. And I particularly loved the fact that she mentioned it was about people, because as I was listening to you, I was thinking that it's hitting high sites on either sides of our planet Earth can be so similar in a way from the same period. So fantastic to see all that lovely archaeology. Thank you very much. And yes, Stonehenge, it's been a World Heritage Site with Avebury and associated sites, the landscape, since 1986. So we've had our 30th anniversary and more. And it really does make it a global site. Obviously, lots and lots of people do want to come and see it. It's very famous these days. But I think if we go back to that expression, studying universal value, I think that just about says it all, doesn't it? Because that's what these sites do mean to us. They're for everyone, and they touch us all in some way. So it's really fantastic. But it's also been so exciting to be working with you, being so helpful to us in this partnership with All Things Japan. Fortunately, as you said, we've had the slight hiccup. We were hoping to do the exhibition in 2019 with, of course, the Olympics, but it's not just us and the Olympics that's been delayed. So we're very much looking forward to trying to do the exhibition in 2022. Fingers crossed that things improve for all of us. And yes, and it's so exciting for us to be actually borrowing items from Japan itself and from the settlement at Maryama. I won't say it as well as you do, particularly at Oyu, which I think is a very exciting site. And we're hoping to even get a flame pot from the Umataka Museum in Niigata. And I must admit, I personally am very much looking forward to being able to see one in our, albeit small, temporary exhibition space at Stonehenge. So we hope that you will all come and visit that when it actually happens. And yes, there is so much research going on at the moment, particularly on the actual stones themselves. I was lucky enough to have an early morning visit last week with some geological colleagues, Richard Bevans from Cardiff University, who's particularly looking at the altar stone, because of course it's a different geology again to what we know as the smaller blue stones and then the massive saracens as well. So there's been a lot of very interesting new geological research, both on the saracens, where Professor David Nash thinks he's pinpointed where they have come from. And Professor Mike Parker-Pearson, among others, is really honing in on where the blue stones might have come from and whether they did come from a different monument, some of them ending up at Stonehenge. So there's never a dull moment. It's all very exciting, but it's absolutely wonderful to have this collaboration with yourselves and of course our partner museums here in Wiltshire, where we're going to hear a bit more from David Dawson in a minute. But I don't know if anyone has any questions specifically about Stonehenge. I can try and answer.
I'm just going to have a look in the Q&A section. What do we got here? I think we're okay, actually. I don't think there's anything specific on Stonehenge in there, Heather, and I know that you need to be getting off, so I don't want to hold you up at all. But just before you go, I just want to say a huge thank you to you, because of course we met. There was a bit of serendipity going on here, a bit of Jōmon fate, I think, at the World Archaeological Congress in Kyoto back in summer of 2016. I can hardly believe it's already 5 years ago. There hasn't been another World Archaeological Congress since. The next one will actually be next summer if I got this right, I believe it's in Budapest. It's either Budapest or Prague. And so in the intervening period between those two World Archaeological Congresses, we've been able to get the exhibition up and running and off the ground from what was just the seed of an idea. So for me, it's testimony to the strength of going to conferences and having dinners with people that you might not have met before, and how wonderful relationships can result from that. So thank you to you, and a huge thank you to the team at English Heritage for making this all happen and for making it such fun along the way as well. We've had some adventures, and I think we'll have many more. One of the things I know we would love to do, and I think our colleagues in Japan would be very keen to do, would be to see whether we can take this model of the twinned archaeological sites, and as well as the stone mines, to be able to do something with stone circles. I think it'll be really exciting. So it'll be fun to explore that with you into the future as well. So thank you very much for joining us and for being the inspiration behind so much of this. So thank you very much. So
thank you.
I'm now going to turn to our colleague, David Dawson, who is as I said, is the director of the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes. David has been an amazing colleague and supporter of what we've been doing for a number of years, actually. And I think I know I've taken a number of groups of Japanese archaeologists to the Wiltshire Museum. We love going there. They've got the best materials, if you ask me, for British prehistory, and beautifully displayed. So it is well worth making your visit down to Devizes if you ever have the chance to do that. We've taken a number of Japanese students to the Wiltshire Museum as well, and David always makes time to show us around for our winter programs in British archaeology. So thank you for doing that, David. And then he also was able to join us in Japan in autumn 2019, when we were doing our recce and meeting some of the potential lenders in Japan. Of course, when you're putting exhibitions together, that is so important. And I'm going to hand over to David now, because I think he's got just a few observations on some of the things that he saw and some of his ideas on that as well. David, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Simon. So I have a couple of images to show, just to sort of really just to start thinking about the links between oh no, that's the wrong one, isn't it? Between Stonehenge and Japan and what we were hoping to do. You always think you got it right, and it never works, does it? Right. Are you seeing full screen?
Yes, we are.
Excellent.
And that's got the Lewis chessmen and the flame
okay.
pot. Yeah.
So where we were sort of involved is very fortunate to be able to go and visit our colleagues in Japan after meeting so many here over in Wiltshire. And we were planning to do an exhibition that was going to bring a series of artworks to the UK created by Japanese artists inspired by Jōmon, the Jōmon culture. So you see here a 3D printed flame pot and a manga comic inspired by Stonehenge and Jōmon culture. But we were also, and this is a key part for us, we were also going to lend some of our Bronze Age pottery to the museum in Nagano. And you've seen some of the Japanese pottery. Here's a couple of examples from our collection. So on the left, a Bronze Age beaker dating to about 2200 BC, and a collared urn that's a bit later, about 1600 BC. And that would have been a focus for them during the World Heritage, the year in which they were hoping to be nominated for as the World Heritage Site, to really cement those links between the peoples who created stone circles. And for me, one of the things that was absolutely fascinating was the pride that people had in Japan of their Jōmon culture. What you see here, rather late at night, and of course I was entirely sober, the whole of the main shopping street at Aomori was lined with these bollards which feature dogu figures. And it really is, it's sort of about a mile long, and these are dotted every sort of 20, technically to 10, 15 yards. And they were just so proud of their heritage. And Simon's already talked about the site at Sane Maryama, which really brought to life people of the time. And you mentioned the fact they were balancing the evidence you could see. So the rather odd-looking photo in the bottom left-hand corner is one of the chestnut posts, which was then reconstructed as this amazing 6-post watchtower structure, and an amazing hall the size of a medieval tithe barn here in the UK. And it really brings the place to life. And the most amazing museums. So this is the site museum. You can see wonderful courtyard and museum stores that a curator would just die for over here. You could eat your dinner off the floor. Absolutely fabulous. But what I loved was bringing it to life. And they used a young lady, the story of a young lady. And you see her here on the left being given a jadeite bead by her mother. On the right, she's being taught how to nurture a chestnut tree. Simon talked about how they were aware of agriculture, but didn't actually take it up. They were certainly cultivating chestnut trees for harvest. And there, rather sadly, at the bottom, you see her mourning her parents, and they are buried in their grave marked by a standing stone. And Nagano Museum, where we were going to lend pots, some of our pottery, and I hope we still will be able to when everything returns to some semblance of normality. And the Niigata Prefectural Museum. And this was absolutely stunning. What you're seeing here is full-size, real-life dioramas with these figures and a whole village in a space that's sort of the size of an aircraft hangar. And it just brought everything to life. It was just absolutely jaw-dropping. So just a few simple observations that for me, what really came to life was the pride that people had in their culture and the Jōmon culture, and how they saw it and how they wanted to tell the story and engage children with being proud of their heritage. And it was just a wonderful sight to behold. And the enthusiasm of the members of staff, as you heard from the team at the Obsidian Museum. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I'm very happy to carry on talking. I'll try and answer any questions. And
thank you, David.
Do my bit.
That's brilliant. It was so nice. I was just so delighted that you were able to come out and see what the Japanese museums and sites look like. More importantly, actually, is to actually meet the Japanese archaeologists and museum curators on their own turf, and so they have the chance to show you what they're doing.
It was such a privilege because I'd met several of them when they came over here, so to be able to go over there was just wonderful.
Absolutely, it's one of the things that I always feel it's just wonderful that we can do these things through the Sainsbury Institute, but also that this possibility of partnering with your museum, with English Heritage, and just sort of telling that story on a much larger scale, I think is rather wonderful. So I'm just going to put up some questions where we do have some questions, which I don't know how many of them are specific to the things that we've been talking about, but there's just to rattle through these, we've got a few minutes, I think. So Rie Takeda asks, is there any trace or indication if the stone circles were built designs in the left or right direction, clockwise or counterclockwise? That's a really interesting question. And I would have to go and think hard about that one and actually look through the reports from the Japanese side. David, have you got any observations of what might happen with British stone circles?
That's a really interesting question. Not really, because they do tend to be sort of symmetrical. You often have alignments like at Stonehenge, it's the midwinter sunset, and other stone circles, particularly up in Scotland, you have recumbent stone circles where there's one flat stone surrounded with a sort of on a circle, and that again is often with midwinter sunrise. But they tend to be generally symmetrical. Or you think of Avebury, where there are the four sort of entrance to the causeways across the henge. So generally symmetrical, I'd say, rather than thinking one way or the other.
That's very interesting. Because there's a tradition in Japanese art of things being a bit asymmetrical, and also, of course, reading Japanese art as you do Japanese books the other way around to what we're used to in the West. So I think there's some mileage to sort of explore that a bit further, maybe.
And I didn't notice anything when we were visiting the stone circles. They did seem there were definite alignments there, and they were also lined up. Something I didn't think you talked about. They were clearly laid out, looking at the faraway mountains, particularly when you were looking across the sea. They really were laid out, as many British stone circles are, with a real deep understanding of a landscape.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very important point, I think. Now, I think Kazi Humayra Rashid, who I think is probably on our online summer program with us at the moment, this is another interesting question. How deeply were the stones embedded in the ground, which mean that the stones are still in place despite the huge level of earthquakes in Japan? And that is a very important question for our Japanese colleagues, certainly. There is a layer of topsoil over the Japanese stones, which meant that they were all originally covered up, unlike our British examples, which have always been there, sort of visible in the landscape. So these really are discovered, and in some cases, I'm thinking about, let me see now. Well, actually, Komakino and also I think Isedotai are covered by volcanic layers. So there've been volcanic eruptions, and then the stones are covered up. So it's only in these large scale development projects today that these things are encountered, and then they're recovered. Interestingly, although we do have evidence from other sites, other types of sites, prehistoric sites, for earthquakes, and you can sometimes see it in the soil. You see where the soil has moved around, and so it pulls apart, and you get lighter or darker soil ending up in those earthquake-created cracks and fissures. I'm not aware of that at the stone circles themselves, but again, I will look into that. It's actually a very interesting question.
The thing that strikes me is the stones are quite. It's just relative to things like the Swindon stone at Avebury. They're quite small. They're sort of half a meter long. They're not large stones, and they are generally quite shallowly set in the subsoil. So it's clearly there's an interest in circles. That's the same, but there are fewer stones that are set upright. Some are, but they tend to be quite small in British terms.
Yeah, that's true. It would be a problem for us if we had as many earthquakes here in the UK as we do in Japan. Those big stones at Stonehenge will be falling over all the time, I think. So,
which they already have, but they can put back up again, but don't tell anyone.
Absolutely, it's all secret, isn't it? And Kazai also asks, is there going to be a recording of this? And yes, we are recording tonight's event, and we're going to make it available online, because I know that many of our Japanese colleagues who had wanted to hear what was happening, it's whatever it is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning over there, so they're all fast asleep. But so yeah, and we'll make sure that those all those links are made public as soon as we've been able to do that. Now, Amanda Maguire, who is one of our PhD students at the University of East Anglia, asks, are there any similarities with later constructions? For example, are any later burial traditions reminiscent of your theory with stone circles being a type of cemetery? And she talks about the Iwari circle. Could the settlement have been abandoned due to disease or disaster, and of the circle being created to protect and or quarantine the area? That's a very interesting set of ideas in there. I know that Amanda is working on Ainu archaeology and history in northern Japan. Similarities with later constructions. The stone circle, there are no stone circles from later in the Japanese sequence. So in the Yayoi period and the Kofen period, they're not building stone circles as such. A lot of their monument building activities get focused on graves. So you get burial mounds is the main form of construction there. But we do have evidence that these sites were definitely cemeteries, because there are pits sometimes dug under the stone circle, the stone arrangements. The stone arrangements are then placed on top of these pits. We did, from some of the soil analysis that's done, and also from some of the types of objects which look like grave goods, and the size of the pits, we think they probably are definitely got that function of being cemeteries. On the abandonment of these sites, I think that's a really interesting question, and there's still work to be done on that, because there's a lot of interesting thinking about the abandonment of Jōmon settlements at certain periods as well. And I would say that is probably a question for future research. But how about on the British side, David? Have you got any observations on those?
Well, one thing that occurs to me on the Jōmon sites is that the soil is very acidic, so bone doesn't survive. Yeah. And I was very struck that there's in the Aomori Prefectural Museum, they had a pot with a burial inside it, and there are one or two, I think, where the bone does survive, but it's very fragmentary. So I think it's an issue of survival. And we talked at the time about how it's very clear that the dogu must reflect the spirit of the people who are buried there, and the dogu are often broken, and it's quite common for the pieces of the dogu, not all to be there, and so as though they've been taken away, the person's spirit has left their body, has gone wherever it's going, and the fragments of the dogu are taken perhaps by members of the family. And I think it's really interesting sort of understanding of how these sites are used.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a rich seam of thinking going on there, I think. So, thank you for that. Samir Mohammed, who I think is probably another of our online summer program students, asks: is it true that Jōmon people are the distant relatives or ancestors of the Ainu and the Ryukyuan peoples? This is something that we often get asked and often talk about, and it's trying to work out who the different peoples who have inhabited the Japanese archipelago over all these millennia actually are. We know that, well, that there's genetic work going on at the moment that suggests that there are close connections between Jōmon populations and other populations of East Asia, and that the Ainu and the Ryukyuan peoples fit into those very big pictures as well. There's no direct connection between Jōmon and Ainu or Ryukyuan. And I say that because there are intervening cultures have been identified. So in the case of Hokkaido, you have a couple of cultures called, something called the Zoku Jōmon or the Epi Jōmon, and then you get a couple of cultures called the Satsumon and the Ohotsk cultures, which have got very distinct cultural identity of their own. The Ainu cultures is thought to really only come into being with sort of a kind of a self-aware ethnic group, if you like, probably from the 13th or 14th centuries. It's a medieval formation, in fact, and there's quite a complicated history going on between those. But it's interesting for me because for many years, to tell the truth, up until really the discovery of Sannai Maryama in the 1980s and 1990s, I think it would be fair to say that most people in Japan didn't really feel much affinity to the Jōmon people. They were regarded as some kind of maybe some kind of strange aboriginal groups, and the sort of the modern Japanese populations had much closer affinity with perhaps the rice farming Yayoi peoples who came in subsequently. There's a huge area of debate and discussion. But what's happened since the discovery of Sannai Maryama, interestingly, is that actually people in Japan now feel much warmer towards the Jōmon, and I think the result of this World Heritage nomination, many of the questions I've been asked over the last few weeks in particular seem to indicate this, that people want to have the Jōmon people as their ancestors now, whereas perhaps 20, 25 years ago, they really didn't. I think that's a really interesting change. And they're kind of, maybe they're more sort of fictive ancestors, I suppose. But for me, there's an interesting, I think there's a comparable set of arguments around who are the people that built Stonehenge, and are they really ancestors to modern day British people? But maybe David, you've got a take on that. I don't know.
Yeah, because, well, it's really interesting because you see all the latest research, and I have to say I often look at that with a slight pinch of salt, or take it with a pinch of salt. You know, the suggestion that the people who are here in the Neolithic, their descendants sort of disappeared from all trace, replaced by the Beaker people in the time of the Beaker period. You know, I think that's a little suspect. I think it's going to get more nuanced as more research comes in. But I think those ideas of identity are clearly very interesting at Stonehenge, because there's the claim of the Druids, who, of course, they might date the Druids as a priestly class, date much later. There's absolutely no link whatsoever with the builders of Stonehenge. But Stonehenge belongs to us all, and many people claim it. And you know, it's fascinating that it's so iconic in Japan as it is in the UK.
Lovely. I've got, I think, probably a couple more questions. So we've got sort of a couple of groups of questions here just before we wrap up this evening. Elizabeth Ellsworth has asked, is there any speculation or analysis about whether the Jōmon pots were used to project dancing images or shadows onto walls using fire? Now, I think this is a really interesting question. It's one that I've often thought about, because we tend to see these pots in beautifully lit museum display cases today. So you can see them in all of their glory, all the detail. But when they were being used, they would have been in relatively dark, what we call pit houses, with sunken floors, with a fireplace in the middle, smoke, fire. I've often thought that, yes, they probably would have been able to sort of project shadows around the walls. And maybe those shadows would have been the basis for all kinds of stories that would have been told around the fire as well. So I think that's a very pertinent observation. We haven't got any absolute evidence for that. And David, I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on the way that pots were being used in prehistory in that way.
Well, one thing that's really interesting is in the Bronze Age in Britain, we have what are called incense cups, and they are about the size of your fist. And quite often, well, there's one in particular called the Stonehenge Cup that's from our collection that has sort of slats down it, and that's said to represent the sarsen stones at Stonehenge. And if you had some oil, scented oil inside, and a wick, set light to it, it would project those shadows, those sort of rays of light, both on the whatever it's sitting on, but also onto the walls of your house or your hut. And there's a few like that. So it's an interesting idea, and certainly when you see the shapes of the flame pots, it does look, they do look amazing. But at the same time, I think you have evidence of fire on the outside, and that they're definitely used for cooking. So it's, they clearly have a practical purpose, even though they're such amazing works of art.
Absolutely, yeah, no, that's great. And I know that in some of the Jōmon pots do seem to have been used as lamps as well. And there's one extraordinary one which is partly in the shape of, it looks like it's in the shape of either a flying squirrel or a bat. And when you see photographs of that taken and the shadows that casts, it is really interesting. So yeah, I think there's mileage in that one. We've got two last questions, which would sort of form one. I think there's Akshat Main and Irina Cristalli, who I guess may also be on our online summer program at the moment, asking about what do we think about Jōmon religious practices, and what was the symbolism of the stones for Jōmon people in relation to death. And I think I'd just say to that there's a lot of work going on at the moment about the nature of perhaps religious and ritual practice in the Jōmon and Yayoi period. My dear friend, Professor Koji Mizuguchi from Kyushu University has just published a really interesting paper in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal on long-term patterns in the ways in which he sees Japanese religious practices developing from the Jōmon into the Yayoi and then into later periods as well, in fact. And I think that's an open access paper, and I'd definitely steer you towards that if you're interested in these kind of themes. Putting forward religious interpretations is always tricky. Well, any archaeological interpretation is always tricky, if you ask me. But I think there is some really interesting. Obviously, it seems that maybe the veneration of ancestors was important. Burial rituals were important. And I suspect that a lot of the objects that we're seeing, and perhaps even the stones themselves, would have been regarded as these days what we might say have some kind of agency or some kind of power themselves. Of course, we see that. And there was one other question about, do these stone circles still have a role to play today? And of course, stones in Japan are sort of venerated in all sorts of ways. And I think one of the things that has struck me very closely about that was that for Jōmon cemeteries, when they're excavated, and indeed for these stone circles as well, you'll often find that the diggers will go and place flowers in amongst the stones for the spirits of the deceased, whether they were, for the people who were originally buried there. So they still do have exercise, I think, a strong influence over contemporary viewers. But David, what would your view on that be from a British prehistoric perspective?
I'm glad you said that, because that's all I could talk about in this context, which is that many of you will have seen the TV programs where Mike Parker Pearson talks about how he worked with a gentleman called Ramaphosa from Madagascar, and he brought him over to the UK and showed him Stonehenge. In Madagascar, they still create monuments made of stone. And to him, as soon as he saw Stonehenge, he said that the stones represent the ancestors. And to me, I really like that as an idea, because that sort of explains why you would bring the stones from the Preseli Mountains. If that's where your ancestors come from, you bring the stones that represent your ancestors. And it sort of makes sense. And I can imagine that could well have happened. It could well be the same in Japan with the Jōmon stone circles.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of our session now, so just remains for me really to thank David very much for joining us this evening, and Heather for taking time out from an incredibly busy schedule at the moment to come and join us, and also for all of the wonderful collaboration as we we know that many things have had to be delayed because of the pandemic. We will get them all back on track. And I think that the partnerships we have in Japan are long-term partnerships. And within that, I know that we'll be able to deliver all the things that we want to be able to do. Thank you all very much for listening and for your wonderful questions. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the chat, I can see as well. So thank you very much indeed for that. As I say, we're going to take a break in August, a well-deserved break for my team at the Sainsbury Institute. We're going to end this evening with a farewell. We say goodbye to the wonderful Hannah Stroud, who's been our office coordinator at the Sainsbury Institute for the last few years, going on to more exciting career paths, I think, in the future. But Hannah, thank you very much for making sure that these Third Thursday events, especially these online Third Thursday events, have run so incredibly smoothly and efficiently. We thank you all very much on behalf of all of our audiences, as well as everybody at the Sainsbury Institute. With that, I say we look forward to seeing you all in September. Please do stay safe and well until then. We've got this massive experiment going on at the moment with the lifting of restrictions. To our colleagues in Japan, I know that all of us here, you have our heartfelt feelings that we very much hope that the Olympics can be held in the safe way promised by the International Olympic Committee. We know that there are very major concerns amongst our colleagues in Japan at the moment, and we wish you all every success, and we, as I say, hope that that all goes safely. And we look forward to catching up with you all again in the autumn. So with that, thank you very much indeed, and good evening. Thank you, David.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, and goodbye.